Let me introduce you to today's speaker. Your speaker today is Dr. Azadeh Riahi. Dr. Riahi is a lead product manager for formulation at Beyond Limits. She's a senior engineer with more than 10 years experience leading software development in multiple high-value industries. Azadeh received her PhD in computational geomechanics from the University of Toronto. And with that, I'd like to pass it over to today's speaker to begin the webinar.
Thank you very much, Ashley. Today, we are going to talk about Formulation Advisor. This is a software solution that we have developed in Beyond Limits with the purpose of addressing some of the needs of lubrication industry by using technology forward approaches such as machine learning and AI. As you may know, there is a continuous need for reformulating lubricants. This need is being derived by legislative requirements that are continuously changing and also customer expectations. Customers expect higher quality products with longer intervals. Also, aligned with the current trend, we are looking for more environmentally friendly products. Companies want to reduce carbon footprint and increase circularity of their lubricants. All of these require new hardware in terms of engine and other hardware. And finally, companies are driven by cost optimization. They want to continuously optimize for material cost and also their program cost. Another factor is new specs that basically to a great extent reflect many of these changes and requirements, including legislative requirements and carbon footprint requirements and also hardware. These factors require continuous reformulation and development of novel new formulation. Every company wants to develop new formulation faster and at a lower cost. This is one of the main objectives of any formulation group. Additionally, there has been a large amount of historic work, I would say, and probably a good portion of historic data that is available for developing new formulation or coming up with novel formulation that can use less frequently used raw material or less frequently used combination. Also, organizations need to continuously reformulate their existing formulation based on the supply chain constraints, such as lack of availability of a raw material within a region. Another big factor is engine test prediction, which is a very complex process and a long and iterative process. Ideally, companies want to reduce the cost and time for engine tests by better prediction of outcome of these new blends with respect to the required engine tests. So what are some of the challenges of formulation in lubricant industry? First and foremost, this is a time-consuming process. It's an iterative. There are a series of test blends and experimental blends that support a final blend. The other factor is that formulations are often optimized locally without looking at the global availability of historic blends and expertise to drive formulation. A big component that is sometimes overlooked is the lack of ability of human mind to process all of those historic blends and make new formulation and decide about the available option out of the whole envelope of decision space. Traditionally, formulators start with formulations which are close to their mind and do not explore the whole spectrum of possible raw material that they can use and also the whole spectrum of historic blends that can support a new formulation. And finally, engine test is a complex process. Prediction of pass and fail is complex. And as I pointed out, the process is iterative, which requires a lot of test plan to support a final blend. So we have a series of polls, and we really appreciate that if you could interact with just a click. The first one is about biggest challenges of your organization. What is the biggest challenge that you see today in the lubricant formulation process at your company? Is it that it's time consuming, local optimization, human limitation? engine test complexity, or other factors? We appreciate it if you could answer this question. Great. So knowing all of these challenges, the question is, what is an ideal solution moving forward? An ideal solution is one that integrates expertise and knowledge. We understand that this is a very domain specific area, and incorporating the domain knowledge is critical for any type of machine driven solution. Additionally, an ideal solution needs to ingest historic data and make conclusions and recommendations by understanding the historic data. And by historic data, we mean formulations, their composition, test data, specifications, industry guidelines, raw material information, all of that data that a formulator need to know and use. Additionally, an ideal solution needs to come up with predictive models that generate potentially hundreds or thousands of candidate or lead blends. It also needs to list all of those potential candidates and provide reasoning as to why it has reached to these conclusions. We think that providing that reasoning is a key component for an industry-specific type of AI solutions, such as formulation in lubricant industry. The software or the ideal solution need to provide a ranking system, but with different lenses, so that the formulator can select the lenses through which they want to rank the formulation, whether that is cost or performance or a combination of different criteria, and use that for selecting their lead formulation. We in Beyond Limit have developed a commercial software solution that addresses the need of formulation industry. Formulation Advisor is a cloud-based commercial software solution that supports the formulation process. It ingests our clients' historic data, and it uses that data and machine learning and AI technique to come up with new formulation or improve existing formulation. Through multiple interaction with our clients, we have shown that using this solution can significantly improve time to market by reducing the development time. It can reduce cost by optimizing the blend, basically reducing the cost on the material side, and also by improving the whole process or program. So it reduces cost both for material and program cost. Additionally, it integrates organizational expertise into the workflow, and it makes it readily accessible across the organization, giving all formulators with different level of expertise access to a uniform process and some years of organizational knowledge driven by experience to use for their projects. Now, the second poll has come up. Our question for you is that what type of software tools you're using today? Is it that you're using Excel sheets, or you're using statistical packages for formulation process, or you have your internally developed software tools or other tools? It would be great to understand what type of software solutions you're using to support formulation process in your organization. So the question is that there are ML and AI solutions out there. What really differentiates Beyond Limits offering? First and foremost, we are offering this solution in terms of integrated commercial software solution. This is very different from an ML or AI service offering that another company may offer. Here you have access to a software that integrates all components of formulation, from having the historic data in a centralized location and providing tools for managing and visualizing historic data, all the way to selecting raw material, prediction, and optimization, all provided in one package, which is available to the user through a user-friendly user interface. Additionally, we offer to integrate some level of organizational knowledge. This can be embedded to the software by providing those knowledge through input files, and occasionally we can integrate part of that directly into the software. And the other component is that it's cloud-based. We use the highest security to provide a platform for interaction that is available for everyone in your organization live across the globe. In terms of what differentiates us in AI or ML, we take pride in combining numerical machine learning with reasoning or symbolic type algorithms and offer a combination of these two that complement each other. We can integrate empirical models and complement them with ML for predicting properties. There are a lot of guidelines in the industry in terms of VGRA, viscosity grade read across base oil interchange and viscosity modifier interchange rules. Those would lead to some inference models that we have developed. So there are a series of very complex logic algorithms that are embedded in the code that support our reasoning. Then we do similarity matching based on domain knowledge to understand the similarity between raw material and also similarity between formulations. And we provide an audit trail into our solution, why the software reached its conclusion step by step is provided, and the evidence for that is also provided to the formulator. So what is the input into the software? Input has different form. We take a series of different files as input categorically. These are data on historic blends. That means that the composition of the historic blend and their performance, what raw material was used in the historic blend, what treat rate they have, and what properties are reported for each blend and what tests they pass. Then we take information on raw material based on the properties of the raw material, their functionalities, and some of the labels and tags. And we can be pretty deep in the level of tags and labels and functionalities that your organization wants to define for the raw material. We also take supply chain constraint and information. We think that this is a really important factor of the software. Organizations can specify the same raw material in different regions. The cost for each regions are hierarchical. We take with global large regions comprising of countries, then even blenders within a country. Availability of raw material in different regions and the cost for each region, it can be ingested into the software. Then we take specification data. Specification is input to our software, which is the beauty of the software. Therefore, we can immediately update ourselves with the latest specification, whether that is OEM or industry spec, or even when we move from one vertical to another, when like the specification change altogether, for us, it's just an input file. Industry guidelines. We take industry guidelines again in form of a tabular data format, but text, and we develop inference algorithm on top of that to apply those industry guidelines. And finally, we offer to take rules and knowledge which are specific to your organization. So if a formulator or within your organization, you have certain rules for mixing raw material, certain constraints, or if there are rules that you want to complement industry guidelines, those can be ingested. The AI engine or the solution will take them into account and apply them in its reasoning and calculations. In addition to these input, then users can interact with the software and provide some input. Those inputs would be the project targets, the targets that they want to satisfy. Users can put additional constraint on the choice of raw material or additional constraint on the properties, such as the viscometric properties. In terms of the back end, there are two main modules for engine test prediction. There are other different modules such as historic data management, but when it comes to prediction, we can say that we have two main modules. One is the candidate blend generation, and the other one is the engine test prediction. These are totally separated, and our customers can opt to buy engine test or decide not to buy engine test. Candidate blend itself has multiple steps into that. The first component is formulate or permutation problem. And here the software goes through the whole decision space of raw material with the constraints that are provided, and it will select the combinations of the raw material that is viable or makes sense based on the domain understanding. Once these combinations are created, namely when the raw material is put together, a candidate blend is created. And the next step is making predictions on the required properties. These properties can be viscometric properties such as KB100, KB40, HTHS, or chemical properties. At the same time, the software uses a cost optimization algorithm to adjust the treat rates so that the cost would be minimized while meeting all the performance criteria, meaning the constraints on properties. Once these candidate blends are generated, now you're having hypothetical blends, and those can be passed to a completely separate module, which is sequential to this module, which is on the engine test prediction. The purpose of the engine test module is to predict the performance of each of these blends with respect to required industry and OEM tests. And here we use categorically different set of algorithms. In the first step, we use industry guidelines to identify which tests can be exempted from the actual testing. So here we use, in the case of lubricants, we are using VGRA, BOI, and VMI guidelines. And we look at the hypothetical blend, and we see for each engine test which of those tests would pass all of these requirements set by guidelines. And if we get a pass on all of those, then we identify that test as a test that can be verified, and it doesn't need to be actually tested. For those tests that we cannot verify them, then in a subsequent step, we assess similarity score. And I will go through this concept more in details when I'm showing the demo. So for each test now, we look at historic data, we understand the similarity between historic data that passed a test and the hypothetical blend that we are proposing, and we give a score to the hypothetical blend for the specific test that we are looking at the similarity score. And similarity score is representative of the probability of passing a test given the historic data. And finally, in the last step, we optimize the engine test sequence based on the probability of passing a test by using the similarity score and also the time and cost for each test. We have had some successful engagement with major oil and gas companies. One of the work that we have done is with a company that they came to us with a relatively complex viscometric constraint. And we used our formulation advisor. We were able to create about 400 lead candidates in a matter of minutes that met their viscometric constraints. Out of those, we proposed a couple of top candidates, and they created those blends in the lab, measured their properties, and we compared our lead candidate with what they created in the lab. And we concluded that the accuracy of predictions for the viscometric indices, multiple of them, were about, on average, 95% or more accurate. Additionally, when we compare our lead candidate with the historic data they passed us, our lead candidate was about 6% cheaper than the cheapest blend in their historic data. And given the volume of production, you can imagine what type or what scale of cost saving that constitutes. And then also we were about 66% faster. So for their formulators, with their expert formulator, it took about 4 weeks to just come up with a blend that meets the viscometric constraint. And for us, it was a matter of minutes. And this time, like of minutes versus week, excludes the time required for engine test, which usually is typically months and months. And based on the feedback from our clients, we can cut 2/3 of that duration when it comes to engine test prediction as well. So with that, I would like to pause here and go through a live demo. As I pointed out, Formulation Advisor is a software solution that is hosted on the cloud and is supporting formulators across the globe with a web-based user interface. We have developed the highest security measures for our software. Each user is required to log in using their email and a secure password. We even support double authentication methods. The idea of the software is to use all of these advances in software to provide a platform that formulators can create projects and they can collaborate and use and share their knowledge. Once they land in, they look at a project dashboard. This dashboard lists all the projects that a formulator has created, or it has been shared with them with other formulators. We can see the project information, date created, owner, number of trials within each project, which I will cover in the subsequent steps. If you see here, there are two main tabs, and also here through the navigation bar, we can see historic data and create a new project. The purpose of historic data is to provide a module or some set of tools for our customers to basically manage and visualize their historic data in an easy and intuitive way. You can see a series of industry specific filters here. We have industry specification. So basically users can select industry specification and the software will pull up part of the historic data that meets these filters. We have OEM specification, viscosity grade, region, and also we have a series of filters for raw material. For example, a user can come select base stock by group, by family, or even a specific name. That means that I can go and say, give me the base stock that use group 1 or group 2 or group 3 in them. So there are different levels or hierarchy of filters that we are considering. Here I can go and say that blends that meet ASEA C3. So with that, the software will go and pull up all the historic blend that meet ASEA C3. I can then click on a blend and look at the composition of the blend in a pie chart format. You can see that we have obfuscated the commercial name just to protect our partners and our clients' data. So here we see this blend, and you see that this is presented in a KB100 versus HGHS graph, which is representative of the industry. Additionally, users can look at these data in a raw format. So this would pull up the list of all blends that meet ASEA C3 historic blends. We can look at the cost data, a relative cost, this is a relative cost, or viscometric properties. We can see what industry targets they're meeting, what OEM targets they're meeting, and also what engine test has been reported for them. The purpose of historic page is to provide an easy way for formulators to examine historic data, all the historic data that exists in their organization, independent of the group and location, and make informed decision for the subsequent steps. For example, if they have a new project that they want to target, now they can, with this information, maybe they would be able to make better decisions in terms of what raw material they can use. Now I come back and I want to create a project. I click on the create a new project. I can give my project a name, demo 21. I would go and say, select my targets. In this case, I want to use ACSC3. I'm going to drop OEM. I'm not going to target any OEM. I'm going to select a viscosity grade, for example, 5W30, and I'm going to select Europe and Africa as my region. With that, a formulator can create a project. Then within each project, formulators can create different trials. The idea of trial is to give formulators or our users the ability to further fine-tune formulation to their need and to examine different options. And again, here we have developed some filters or some tools that reflect the need of the industries. For example, I can put a cap on the number of base stock I want to use or the number of viscosity modifier. I can go and select base stock. I can say that I want to use base stock that only blends that only use these 3 groups. Even I can go further and select a commercial name by name. Similarly, we can use these filters for viscosity modifier and additive pack. Now, for additive pack, given the complexity, we can even give the user the option to define a fixed recipe. And not only they can select a core additive with it and specify its street rate, but they can even specify multiple boosters, and create an additive pack if they wish to. And finally, they can select, for example, a PPD. They can go and further constrain the viscometric limits. And these limits are coming from the project targets that I have specified. The agent will automatically select the project target, these limits based on the project target, sorry. But then within the acceptable limits, users can further constrain any of these properties. So with this, now I can go and click Generate Blend. Once I click Generate Blend, you can see that a progress bar will open. You can see the progress. I created another trial last night that took only 2 minutes and 16 seconds. So while we are waiting for this trial to complete, I can show you the result of a completed trial. This one was focusing on a CLC3 BMW Type 1 5W30 Europe and Africa. And we created about 300 blends for this trial. Here on the result page, you see the blends. They're sorted with respect to relative cost. These arrows will enable users to sort these blends with respect to any of these properties. Then you can see the composition of the blend, the raw material that have been used, and their treat rates. And then we can see the reported properties for these blends. Similar to the historic data page, I can click on each of these blends and I can look at the composition of this blend and the raw material that have been used in them. Again, if you click on any of these pies, you can see the inventory number, manufacturer, the functionality of each of these raw materials, including what group of base stock they are, or for example, what type of viscosity modifier they are, or what functionality of the booster is used in this blend. All can be seen very easily. We also provide a prediction on the chemical content of a blend. So here you see the spider chart of all chemical properties for this blend. So the first step of the software is to come up with viscometric properties, raw materials, and composition. Users here can validate the results and make sure that they're within the limit they want, the type of raw material makes sense, the cost makes sense. When they are happy with these predictions, now they can move to the second step or second module, which is the engine test prediction. Now, this is a completely separate module. You can decide to buy this depending the need of your company or opt out of it. The purpose of engine test prediction is for the hypothetical blend, for each hypothetical blend, predict the performance with respect to required tests. If you can see this blend, for example, blend 1 is selected, first, the agent will go and identify the tests which are required for this project target. So these tests are identified based on the industry and OEM spec that the user has selected. Automatically, the software will go, it will look at these spec and information about them, and it will identify the tests. Now, for each of these hypothetical blend and for each of these tests, it will use a combination of different algorithms to come up with the potential of passing a test. In the first step, for each of these tests, it will see if that is a verified test. For that, for example, if you look at VWTD1, it takes this test for this specific blend. It will go through all historic data that supported this test. And it will apply the read across and interchange rules on them. This would be viscosity grade, BOI, and BMI, VGRA, BOI, and BMI. And if it gets a pass for all three, then it would identify this test as a pass. For those tests that could not be exempted by this process, which is a relatively complex set of logic algorithms, then it will go through a similarity matching. It will look at historic data that passed this test. And again, for each test, for each hypothetical blend, it will identify the similarity between the hypothetical blend and the test and the historic blend and gives it a score of 0 to 3 based on different indices. Now, given that the envelope of historic data, the number of tests, and the number of hypothetical blends. You can imagine how many calculations the software needs to perform. And it usually does that in a matter of a minute or so. One of the biggest and most promising aspects of this solution is its ability to scan the whole database of historic data and use that in support of its recommendation. This is something which is beyond a formulator's mind to do. And I touch on this component again in the audit trail. Finally, in terms of functionality, now based on the similarity score, cost, and time for each test, it will propose an optimum sequence of testing to minimize the risk, time, and also cost for the test. A big component of our solution is providing audit trail. Now, for each of these blends, you see a separate audit trail. So here you can see that this blend is identified for its relative cost, for its engine cost compared to, let's say, others, and also for other components. Then we provide two sets of audit trail, going back to the candidate blend generation and engine test prediction. On the candidate blend generation, we provide information as to why we selected these raw material. And for that, we look at historic data and also the input that was provided by the organization or the user. For example, in this blend, base stock 018 and 032 has been used. And for that, we're gonna scan the historic data. And if we use this, we're gonna give you reasons as to why we use this. We use this combination because this was supported in historic blend with this ID. You can go and look back at this historic blend and make a judgment whether this combination makes sense or not. So using machine learning, we learn combination. We don't, for example, combine a group 1 with group 5 because we know by learning from the historic data that that is typically not happening. Similarly, for viscosity modifier, for additive pack, we will look at industry and OEM spec and see which historic blends support those and what type of additive pack with what treat rate have been used in them, and use those as evidence. So for example, this additive pack was used with this treat rate because it was used in historic blend that satisfied the project target, and we provide the ID of those ones. Here, for example, in this case, I chose a specific 4.2% in my calculation. So if users also put an input, that would be provided in the audit trail. We use this PPD 07 because it was selected by the user. And also treat rate were derived because we wanted to do a cost optimization. These treat rates for base stock guarantee lower cost. So this is the audit trail on the historic, on the raw material combination. Then for the verified tests, again, and non-verified tests, we provide an extensive audit trail. So here for VWTD1, which if you recall, it was an exempt test. We will look at historic data, and then we will provide if a historic data supported this read across, all three read across. We would give the idea of this historic blend or the code and what other information about it, including what viscosity grade it met, what claim and body. Then we will go through each of these rules and provide a lot of information, including if it was met, if we couldn't get to a conclusion because of lack of data, was it a lack of data from the historic side or a lack of data in raw material? If there are parameters that need to be calculated, we will provide the values of those parameters. What was the calculation for historic blend? What was the calculation for candidate blend? So all of these are provided extensively for each blend, for each test in our audit trail. Then for the tests that could not be exempted, also there we will provide an audit trail. So this is a test that was not exempted. We have a similarity score of 1. And here we will go through different indices, similarity in additive pack, which we evaluate using a lot of considerations, the similarity in viscosity modifier and similarity in base stock. So we'll consider these 3 indices and we compare similarity of this hypothetical blend with the historic blend that passed this test. And we also list the ID or code of those historic blends. Now, If a historic blend is repeated under any of these indices, it means that it had more than one component repeated. Then that would give us a level 2 or level 3. So level 1 would be, we found historic blend that supported only one aspect, one similarity. Level 2 would be historic blend had two aspects in common with the hypothetical blend, and level 3 means that we found at least one historic blend that had all three components similar with the hypothetical blend. And that would give us an idea of how probable it is for this hypothetical blend that we recommended to pass this specific test. And again, the beauty lies in the fact that scanning all of these historic blend and all of this hypothetical blend and all of these required tests one by one to come to these conclusions and providing evidence is absolutely beyond any human mind's power. And that opens the door for doing things quicker, faster, at a lower risk, and way more efficiently. That is a very quick overview of our Formulation Advisor software solution. So I pause here and I would be very happy to answer your questions.
Thank you, Azadeh. That was a very insightful presentation and a demo. So we do have quite a few questions that have come in. I'm going to start with the ones in the Q&A feature. So the first question that came in, which input data is more critical for the software to give a good suggestion between the historical data and the rules and knowledge?
We basically at the end, we are proposing to use data-driven modeling. Therefore, the most critical input for us is data on your historic blends and raw material. The more you have historic blend and raw material, the better we will be in our data-driven approaches. So historic data is critical. We use rules and knowledge to complement historic data to put constraints. Some of it is just inference logics. If you're not interested in them, you don't need that. And some of it is to compensate for sparsity in your data. So for example, if your measurements on CCS is really not complete, then we can complement that with models that correlate CCS at like CCS 15 or 20 based on CCS 35. And so historic data is the most critical one. That is the one data that we for sure need.
The next question, could you elaborate more on what it is like for the AI to self-learn? Does it require the human in the loop?
That is a very good question. At this point, we are using historic data. We scan the historic data and we learn from that. We do take some, again, we are open, flexible, not that we require it. It's not critical component. If you put some rules and knowledge into that, we integrate that and compensate machine learning. So that gives it an AI solution. In terms of self-learning, we learn based on each time that you pass the data to us. We retrain the model. So the software is actually capable of taking data on any like daily basis. You can push data to our database. We retrain the model and we learn. At this point, we do not have a feedback loop, meaning that as a user, you cannot go and say, I dislike this formulation. Don't create combinations which are like that. But a form of human loop is envisioned for version 2 of the software. So in version 2, you can take blends, make measurements in the lab, then input those measurements through the UI, and now use those new measurements through an interactive UI loop to basically help this agent learn from the feedback that you provided.
The next question, how does the new chemistry moiety is taken into consideration for property prediction? Do we need to input chemical data of this moiety into the system, or will it fetch itself from various sources?
Chemical signature is an important component and consideration for generated blend, and especially it's very important for also additives. So currently we make predictions on the chemical signature of a blend by having some information about chemical properties of a base stock and also chemical properties of the additive pack. For base stock, only some basic ones such as sulfur level are important. But for additive pack, we take this chemical signature of additives and boosters and use that for our predictions.
The next question, how does AI work if we do not have any historical data for any project?
It's very difficult to get it working. That's not the AI part of it, but rather the machine learning part of it. Historic data is input to this software. We need them. Basically, if you do not have any data, you cannot derive data-driven models. However, you don't need data that exactly meet your project targets. So for example, if a new specification comes out or a new viscosity grade becomes very important, that historically you didn't develop plans for 0W30, and now you want to develop formulation for 0W30, you don't need historic data that meets 0W30. You just need to give us blends with their measured viscometric properties. We take the limits of the new spec and then we make predictions for the new blends so that they meet the new spec. So going back to your question, we need a good amount of historic data to come up with trends of the behavior of the properties. For example, how KB100 works, what is the trend for KB100 or HTHS and so on and so forth. We don't need that data to meet your project target or your target in historic data. That is not a requirement.
A few more questions. The next one, are industry specifications part of the packages?
Industry specifications are input to our solution. Now, if you don't have industry specifications, we can work with you and provide you those. But our preference is that our client provide industry specs and OEM specs as an input. We like this model because it gives them flexibility to basically put any of them with any version that they have used historically through 10 or more years. And also it gives us the ability to immediately adjust to the new spec. So if a new spec from BMW comes out and BMW has a relationship with you and it provides that to you, all you need to do is just put it in the input files, which is very easy, and then use it on the UI. We don't interfere, and then the software will automatically pick that up and use it and create blends for you.
Is the software limited to engine tests or other performance data for other types of lubricants that can also be predicted, like input files from other test results?
I'm assuming here you're referring to engine tests. If you're referring to analytical tests, we take the values of all analytical tests, whether those are chemical measurements or viscosity measurements, such as MRV or KB100, KB40, all of those. So for all of those, we take the measurements and those test values are input. For the engine test, you had a great observation. If you're referring that, do we predict the values of tests reported for the test? We do take the input that what was the measured property for each test. At this point, we just predict a pass and fail. We don't predict measurement of engine test side only. And there is a reason for that. You can imagine that the prediction models would be more or less the same. The issue is that the amount of data required for making robust predictions is usually, even for our very mature companies, for engine test side is not enough. So the challenge is that if you want to make prediction on the value of an engine test, you need to have enough data to support data-driven models there. We can do that.
The next question, as per the details shared, the software seems to be for the prediction of engine oils only. Please clarify whether it can be used for other types of lubricants.
Another great question. Yes, this UI that you saw here is more configured for engine tests. Having said that, I want to add basically everything that was related to engine tests was input. So if the spec changes for another industry, that's only an input to our model. But I understand your point. We are very keen on extending this to other industries vertically and horizontally, because the main component of the solution, which is selecting raw material, making predictions for different properties using ML predictive tools, and then also optimization. These are all generic algorithms that are agnostic to the industry. We can easily, the software, as you saw, is very modular and we can easily configure it for different applications. We do like to customize the UI for industrial lubricants, and we would like to work with other industries to customize the UI for that. So we are very open to that idea, and we will work with you if you have use cases in other industries.
The next question, can you add tests and results which are developed in-house and maybe proprietary to a customer into the model?
Absolutely. That's where I'm going with the beauty of the software. We could have taken all of these things integrated, but in our model, we decided to provide the platform and remain as much as possible agnostic to industry and test. Test is an input. There is a file that would tell you, put your test, give your test a name, and all you need to do is to basically in your data, and we'll help you there because everything is well structured, connect your historic blends or measurements, blends with measurement to that data. So you name it, any test, you give it a name, you define its properties, and you report the measured properties for blends. We can take it and we can make predictions on that. All of this there's a caveat. You need to have enough data, and all we need is the sample points so that we can develop regression models out of them.
What are the biggest modeling challenges for formulations to predict performance? What types of models do you use?
From implementation, this was a very extensive project. As you maybe noticed, there are not one type of model. It's very different type of models that we are using. For example, for raw material selection, how to intelligently sample from the space in a way that we can get to the global optimum while this is done in a reasonable amount of time. So we have been exploring different algorithms, grid search, Bayesian sampling. In terms of the regression, we have been using different regression models. We even explored deep learning for a while. There are pros and cons to them. Inference algorithms are logic. So these are some of the algorithms that we have used, and I can name. The biggest challenge, so we have a lot of challenges internally. We are continuously having R&D that supports our product, and we have overcome a lot of them. We would love to continuously improve based on recent improvements in hardware and software. But those, you would not see any of them. At this point, the software it has a very high performance. In a matter of minutes, it gives you solution. The biggest challenge that I would say exists for this industry, there are two components into that. Data is scattered. Data is the biggest commodity of this century. And it is to the benefit of your organizations to bring the data in a centralized form and leverage that. And what we see as our biggest challenge is that companies are not ready, or their data is very scattered, and bringing data to one centralized format so that it can be ingested takes a lot of time. We are very willing to work with you, and we think that that the time has come for this industry and even other industries in other horizontals we have experienced, even the advanced ones like pharma. It is time to leverage data. The time has come. The trend has started in consumer. You can see how our data is being exploited for ad and everything. This is very valuable asset. We need to take advantage of that. This is one challenge. The other challenge is that there's a little bit of data sparsity in some component. For example, some properties like CCS, some engine tests, there's less of a data for them. And again, having this software, we can complement with some rules, but the beauty is that from this point on, everything would be managed well, and hopefully you can, as an organization, build a good data set after using this for a while.
3 or so more questions. I believe you answered this next one, but if you'd like to elaborate, is the historical data a built-in database or provided by the user?
A great question. It's provided by the user. The main reason is the fact that data is an asset of our customers, And our business model is based on the fact that we only do self-learning. We improve our model based on your data and provide those improved model to your organization. We don't transfer knowledge from one data set to another. We don't have memory of your data or memory of learning from your data. We think that that is critical for the competitive edge that exists in this industry, and we want to protect that 100%. So we are not going to give away any type of learning from one to another. And for this reason, we ingest your data, we use it for your purpose only.
Another question that you touched on a little bit, but if you'd like to elaborate more, is there a generalized version of the software that isn't specific to engine lubricants?
The back end of this solution is already generalized. What you see very specific is the UI, which is for industry, and we would like to work with our partners and customers. We developed this software by working with probably two major oil and gas companies. And we think that there is a real value into that. We are expert in machine learning, AI, and software. We are a commercial software solution company. We don't want to be a domain specific company. And the beauty of this partnership lies in the fact that we are equipped and trained to work with domain experts to develop the UI in a way that makes sense for the domain. And this is a win-win because you don't need to hire machine learning and software engineers in your company, and we don't need to know your domain. We can hire, but we think that there is a value in working with organizations, and we really encourage you to work with us to develop software solutions which are for another vertical or industry.
And we have two more questions left. The first one, could you elaborate more on the AI model, how it is built, which type of model?
I think that I already answered that question. It is not one single model. It's a aggregate of many different models. On raw material sampling, we use certain models. One of the ones is Bayesian sampling and derivatives of that sampling. On prediction, we use different regression models. We did explore deep learning. We are not using deep learning for very solid reasons, but we are continuously doing research on that front. Then we have a series of inference algorithm for read across. So it's an aggregation of multiple models that we're using.
And then our last question for today, how many minimum data points are required to create historical data for predicting properties of blends?
This is another great question. Generally, the more data that you have, the more accurate we will be. We have worked with clients which had 500 data points and have gone all the way to work with clients that had 50,000 data points. As you can imagine, how many historic blend we need is a matter of how wide is your raw material. So it's not just that, it's a solid rule. The more you have the more raw material database that you have, the wider your raw material library and historic use case of your raw material is, then we need to have more historic blend. So I covered 500 to 50,000 is the range that we have dealt with so far successfully. The example that I gave you actually as a success story was about 500. But then rule of thumb is this: for any raw material that you have in your database, we need at least 10 different measuring points. I'd say that your raw material need to be repeated in 10 historic blends with 10 different rates. So 10 points for each raw material is the rule of thumb.
Thank you, Azadeh. And with that, I think we've reached the end of the webinar for today. Thank you everyone for joining us today. Thank you, Azadeh, for taking the time to stay to the end to answer everyone's questions. I think with that, we hope everyone has a wonderful day. We hope to see you back online for another webinar soon. Thank you.
Thank you.